In this lesson, we'll discuss two special instance methods that we can define in our test classes, and they are called setUp and tearDown. These are typically used to create what are called test fixtures. A test fixture is a piece of code that constructs and configures a system under test. So the tests can then focus on the assertions rather than the setup that is required to get there. So let's begin by defining a few classes which will work together in tandem, and then we'll write a test suite for one of them. So let's say that I'm designing a system for restaurant modeling, and every restaurant is going to have an address as well as an owner. And I'm going to use the feature of composition to nestle some attributes on a restaurant object to be other custom objects that I've defined. So let's begin by defining an address object. So I'm going to have a class called address, and in here I'll declare a dunder_init, and each address will simply have a city as well as a state, and I can assign those to their respective attributes. So self.city equals city, and then self.state equals state. Below here, every restaurant is also going to have an owner. So in here, I'm also going to define a dunder_init, and the only things that an owner is going to have is a name and an age. Once again, we're going to take those arguments and assign them to attributes on each owner object that we create. Finally, I'm going to have a restaurant class. So class restaurant, and of course, as mentioned earlier, each restaurant is going to have an address as well as an owner. And of course, my goal here is to feed in my objects that I've constructed above. So I want to feed in an address object as well as an owner object, and I'm going to attach those as attributes on a restaurant object, which of course I'll call address as well as owner. Let's make it a little bit more interesting by defining some more functionality for the restaurant. For example, I can define a property, and that property will be the owner's age. And the way that I can get to an owner's age is by going to my owner object, which is represented by self.owner. And I know that on an owner, I'm going to have an age attribute. So I can do self.owner.age. That'll get me the owner's age from a restaurant's perspective, from a restaurant object. And below, let's also define a method called summary. And in summary, all it's going to do is return a formatted string. And that string is going to say, this restaurant is owned by. And now let's go ahead and get the owner's name. We know we have an owner object represented by self.owner. And on that owner object, we are going to have a name attribute. So I can say this restaurant is owned by self.owner.name and is located in, once again, we have to get this information from our address. So we know our address has a city attribute. So I can do self.address. This address attribute is coming right here from our dunder_init. We know it's going to be an address object, and it's going to have a city. So I can do self.address.city and close off this interpolation and finish it like so. So now let's go ahead and create a test suite to test our restaurant object. So below, I'll define a new class. This is going to be our test class. I'm going to call it test restaurant. And as always, we're going to inherit from unittest.testCase. Let me create a few more lines here so we can have a big palette here to work with. Okay, so here are the two instance methods that I wanted to introduce you to. The first one is called setUp, and it's going to be a lowercase s and a capital U. I'm going to put a pass in here, as well as tearDown. Tear with a capital D down. And both of these are instance methods, so we are going to have to provide self here. And don't forget the colons as well. So these methods have to be named like so. They're not simply up to us to name them whatever we want. These methods have to be called this because they're actually going to be overriding similarly named or identically named methods that we inherit from test case. So the way these work is that these are going to execute before and after each test, right? So setup, predictably, is going to set up a test. So this function, this method, will run before every single test in this class. So if I have, for example, 3 instance methods that begin with test, setup is going to run 3 times, once before each one of those methods runs. And conversely, tearDown is going to run after every single test in our test suite. So if we have 3 test methods below, tearDown is going to run 3 times, once after those. They must be named like this. Now, what is the typical situation in which you might use these? Well, again, setup is where we're going to set up all the functionality we need for testing. And a scenario like this is really optimal because if you think about it, there's a lot of complexity when it comes to creating a restaurant object, right? Because for us, to have a functional restaurant object, we also need to instantiate an address object. We also need to instantiate an owner object. It can become pretty tedious and pretty repetitive to keep pasting all that logic below. So for example, here, let's say I want to define a restaurant object. Well, first I need to define an address, which I can assign to an address variable. So here I'm instantiating an address instance, and of course I need to provide a city, so let's do New York. And I need to provide a state, so let's do New York as well. And then of course I also need to instantiate an owner, which means I need to use this syntax to have an owner object. And let's say my owner's name is Jackie, and let's say that his age is going to be 60, right? And then finally we can go ahead and instantiate a restaurant, and that restaurant is going to have an address as well as an owner, right? So this is 3 lines of syntax that it takes us to get a functional restaurant. So in these kinds of situations, you don't want to go ahead and copy this code in every single test, in every single instance method, because it's going to be incredibly repetitive. So instead what we do is just define one method right here called setup. And in this body, this code will run automatically before each and every test. There's only one problem here. Simply creating something and assigning it to a variable here, like let's say I call this restaurant Golden Palace. These now currently exist as local variables, which means as soon as the setup function is done running each time, they're going to be tossed out of memory. We have to make sure that these are available to be used within our tests, which we'll write in just a second. In order to make them available, we have to assign them as attributes of this test restaurant object. The way we can assign them as attributes is pretty simple. We have self right here, so I can do self.goldenpalace. So again, the Golden Palace name is up to me, but whatever I assign it to here is what I'm going to be using in my assertions. Just to make sure this is really clear, what I want to do is add another print function here and simply print something like this will run before each test, just so we understand what it's doing here. And for tearDown, I'm going to put another print function and write this will run after each test. Now you may be thinking, what's the point of the tearDown method? Well, this is ideal for finalizing an operation. Sometimes you want to clear something that's happened. Sometimes you want to change an object back to its default state. Sometimes you may want to do the inverse. So for example, if you're testing file creation, your tearDown method may delete the file that you just created because you don't want all of them adding up and consuming space on your hard drive. So tearDown is to clean things up, while setup is to configure them to be tested, right? For now, we're not going to put anything in tearDown besides this print function. The goal here is just for you to see how these print functions will execute and where they're going to appear in the terminal. So let's go ahead and write a few tests here. So I'm going to do test owner age. That is a property on our object. So what is our object here? What is our restaurant object that we want to test? Well, it's available in an attribute here called Golden Palace. So here is Golden Palace, right? And all I have to do here is, of course, wrap this in an assert equal and test that when I have a Golden Palace and I ask it for its owner age property, that should give me 60. Remember, we're getting 60 here because that is the age of the owner, and what this property is doing here is accessing the owner object and talking to its age attribute. So this is one example of a test, which means we're going to have setup run, then we're going to have this test run, and then we're going to have tearDown run in this scenario. So let's go ahead and execute this, see if this works. There you go. This will run before each test, and this will run after each test. The reason we only have this output once is because we have only one test defined. However, if we add another test here, like test our summary method, we can assert equal here, and I'm going to break this up across several lines. If I take my object, which again is going to be called Golden Palace, referenced or prefixed by self because it is defined on this object, what I want to do is invoke the summary method on that restaurant object. And of course, I expect it to be a string very similar to this one. So I can say this restaurant is owned by. At that point, I expect the owner's name, which should be Jackie. So this restaurant is owned by Jackie and is located in. And at that point, I expect the city, and the city here is New York. So here I'm going to put New York, and then we also have a period at the end of the sentence. So let's go ahead and execute this. We're still going to have a passing test suite, but notice now we have 2 outputs right here. This will run before each test, and then we have this will run after each test, right? And we see it in sequence, and the reason that it's in sequence is important is because it's running once before and once after each test. So the way this works is Python's going to say, I'm going to do setup, then I'm going to run a test. Then I'm going to do tearDown. Then I'm going to do setup again. Then I'm going to run the other test. Then I'm going to do tearDown. Now, technically speaking, the order in which Python runs these tests can be random. You should never assume that you're going to have this one run first necessarily. However, what you can take for granted and assume to be safe is that regardless of how many tests there are, before each of them, setup will run once, and after each of them, tearDown will run once, right? And that's why we're seeing these outputs right here. And if we had 10 instance methods here, 10 different tests, well then setup would run 10 times and tearDown would run 10 times as well. Again, the purpose of these is to configure something like this so we don't have to copy and paste lines 28 through 30 into every single test. So setup is used to set up, to create some test fixtures, to create some objects that we can use within our tests so that our assertions here are very simple and clean. And teardown, here we didn't provide a more concrete example, but usually it's used to finalize an operation, like deleting a file that you created, or maybe setting an object back to its original state. So maybe the Golden Palace will have some kind of reset method that you may want to call here. Now again, because we are running setup each time, remember that every single time we're actually instantiating a brand new restaurant object. So we're not dealing with the same object throughout these two tests. Each one of these two is dealing with a brand new restaurant because setup is running once before each. But sometimes if you, for example, want to keep the same object throughout multiple tests, but you want to perform some kind of logic after you've done an assertion, you can do it right here in the teardown. That will run after each one. And that's all there's to cover in this lesson. We talked about two instance methods called setup and teardown. You have to write their names in this exact way because you're overriding methods that are inherited from test case. These allow us to set up the environment and break down the environment that we create for our tests where they make their assertions. A lot of people like to keep their tests very slim and mean and provide all of the setup within their setup and teardown methods. That's all there's to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.